During my husband's funeral luncheon, my daughter-in-law handed me a printed bill for using the Caldwell family name. I remember looking down at that white envelope beside my glass of iced tea, my black gloves still folded neatly in my lap, and thinking for one strange second that grief had made me misunderstand what I was seeing. We had buried Richard less than 2 hours earlier. The scent of lilies still clung to my coat. My feet ached from standing beside his casket at St. Matthew's, while people told me what a good man he had been, how devoted he was, how lucky I had been to share 46 years with him. I had nodded through all of it because that was what widows did in public. They held themselves together. They thanked people. They accepted hugs from relatives who had not visited in years. They smiled gently when someone said, "He's in a better place now," even though the only place I wanted him was beside me in the passenger seat of our old Buick, reminding me not to miss the turn onto Maple Avenue. The luncheon was held at Benton's, a small restaurant in Columbus where Richard and I had celebrated our 40th anniversary. He loved their pot roast and complained every time they changed the dinner rolls. I chose that place because it felt familiar, safe, almost tender. I thought the family would sit together, share stories, maybe laugh softly over the kind of memories that make loss bearable for a few minutes at a time. Instead, I was seated at the far end of the long table, beside a cousin of Richard's I had met twice in my life, and across from a floral arrangement so large I could barely see my own son. Mark sat near the center, shoulders stiff in his navy suit, his eyes lowered to his coffee cup. Vanessa sat beside him in a fitted black dress, accepting condolences with both hands wrapped around other people's fingers, as if she were the one who had lost the man she slept next to for nearly half a century. She was very good at that, making herself the center of rooms that did not belong to her. I had noticed it for years, in small ways, the changed seating arrangements, the family photos where I stood at the edge, the holiday invitations that arrived, after everyone else had already chosen a time. But that day, I was too tired to fight shadows. I kept telling myself, "Eleanor, get through the meal. Go home. Take off these shoes. Sit in Richard's chair for a minute and breathe." Then Vanessa rose from her seat and walked toward me with the calm, polished smile she used when she wanted witnesses. The conversation around the table softened but did not stop. Silverware touched plates. Someone poured water. She placed the envelope beside my glass and tapped it once with one red fingernail. "Eleanor," she said, "since Richard handled certain family matters while he was alive, I thought it would be best to clarify things now." Her voice was gentle enough to sound considerate to anyone not listening closely. I opened the envelope because I still believed, foolishly, that even Vanessa had limits on the day of a funeral. Inside was a single printed page. At the top, in bold letters, it said family name usage fee. Beneath it were itemized charges. Attendance under the Caldwell name. Representation at memorial service. Continued residence in Caldwell family property. Emotional inconvenience to immediate family. The total at the bottom was $18,750. For a moment, the restaurant became perfectly quiet inside my head. I could still see mouths moving, still hear the hum of the air conditioner above us, but everything felt distant, as if I were sitting underwater. Vanessa leaned closer and whispered, "Since Richard is gone, you're technically not entitled to benefit from the Caldwell name anymore." My son did not look up. Not once. That was the part one felt first. Not the insult. Not the money. Not even the cruelty of doing it before the coffee had gone cold. I felt Mark's silence, heavy and familiar, settling over me like another black coat. I folded the bill carefully along its crease, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in my purse. Vanessa watched my hands, waiting for tears, waiting for a scene, waiting for me to prove whatever story she had already told about me being unstable and confused. I gave her none of it. I lifted my glass, took one small sip of iced tea, and looked at the woman who had just tried to charge a widow for her own married name. Then I smiled. Not because it was funny, not because it did not hurt, but because Richard, careful Richard, quiet Richard, had once told me that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think you have nothing left. Vanessa believed she had handed me a bill. She had no idea she had just handed me evidence. That morning had begun with a silence so complete it felt almost physical. I woke before 6, not because I had slept well, but because my body still expected Richard to reach across the mattress and pat my hand twice, the way he had done every morning for as long as I could remember. The room was gray with early March light. His side of the bed was smooth and cold, the pillow untouched except for the shallow dent I had made the night before when I pressed my face into it and tried to find the last trace of his aftershave. For a few minutes, I did not move. I listened to the furnace click on downstairs, to the old pipes knocking softly in the walls, to the ordinary sounds of a house pretending nothing had changed. Richard's navy suit still hung on the back of the closet door. The one he had worn to church, to weddings, to Mark's college graduation, to every occasion he believed deserved respect. I had asked the funeral director to dress him in the charcoal one instead, because the navy suit still felt too alive to give away. I sat at the edge of the bed and looked at it until my eyes blurred. Then I stood, because there were things a widow had to do whether her heart agreed or not. I showered. I pinned my silver hair low at the back of my neck. I chose a plain black dress and the pearl earrings Richard had given me on our 30th anniversary. My hands shook when I fastened the clasp, not from age, but from the strange cruelty of needing to look composed on the day my life had been split in two. Downstairs, the kitchen waited in perfect order. Richard's coffee mug sat upside down in the drying rack, the blue one that said "Best Grandpa" in uneven letters Lily had painted when she was 8. I almost reached for it, then stopped myself and took a plain white cup instead. I drank half a cup of coffee standing at the counter because sitting at the breakfast table alone felt like admitting something final. At 7:30, my phone lit up with a message from Mark. No call. No good morning, Mom. No asking whether I needed help. Just one sentence. Vanessa thinks it is better if we meet you at the chapel. I read it twice, then set the phone down beside the sugar bowl. Better for whom? I wondered, but I did not type that. I had spent years swallowing questions before they became arguments. Richard used to notice. He would look at me over the newspaper and say, "Ellie, peace is not the same as being erased." I would smile and tell him not to worry, that Vanessa was young, that Mark was busy, that families took time to settle into themselves. I wanted to believe patience could soften people. It had not softened Vanessa. It had only taught her how far she could push. When I arrived at St. Matthew's, the parking lot was already half full. The wind cut across the pavement, sharp enough to sting my cheeks, and for one painful moment I wished Mark had come to walk me inside. Instead, I carried my own coat closed with one hand and held Richard's folded handkerchief in the other. Vanessa was standing near the entrance, greeting guests in a voice warm enough for strangers. She touched my elbow as I approached, just lightly enough to look kind. "Eleanor," she said, "we saved you a seat." Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Caldwell. Eleanor. Inside, I saw what she meant. The first pew was filled with Mark, Vanessa, Lily, and Vanessa's parents, who had known Richard mostly through holiday dinners and polite cards. My place was in the second row, beside Richard's older cousin and behind my own son. I looked at the empty space where I should have been and felt something inside me go very still. Vanessa leaned close and whispered, "It is just easier this way." People get confused about family order at these things. Family order. 46 years of marriage reduced to a seating chart. I could have objected. I could have asked Mark to move over. I could have made every head in that church turn. But Richard was at the front of the room, surrounded by white roses, and I would not let my last public hour with him become Vanessa's little theater. So I sat where she placed me. I folded Richard's handkerchief in my lap. I watched the back of my son's head through the entire service and waited for him to turn around. He never did. At Benton's, Vanessa became softer the moment other people could see her. She stood near the entrance of the private dining room with a stack of small cream-colored place cards in her hand, guiding guests to their seats, as if she had spent her whole life hosting bereaved families. "Mrs. Bennett, thank you so much for coming. Uncle Ray, you are right over here. Lily, sweetheart, sit next to Grandpa and Grandma Pierce." Every word sounded warm. Every movement looked careful. If a stranger had walked into that restaurant, they would have thought Vanessa was carrying the whole sad day on her shoulders, while I was simply one more elderly relative who needed managing. I watched her from the doorway, my coat still over my arm, as she placed Richard's sister near the center of the table and Mark's business partner near the window. Then she glanced at me, just briefly, and pointed toward the far end. "You are down there, Eleanor. It will be quieter for you." Quieter. That was the word people used when they wanted to move an old woman out of the way without sounding unkind. I walked to the end of the table and sat beneath a framed watercolor of the Scioto River, so far from Mark that I could barely hear him when he thanked the server for bringing coffee. The chair beside him, the chair that should have been mine, stayed empty for several minutes until Vanessa set her purse on it. I folded my hands and looked at the white tablecloth. There was a tiny brown stain near my plate, probably coffee from some earlier lunch, and for reasons I could not explain, that stain nearly undid me. Not the casket, not the church, not the flowers. That little stain on a rented tablecloth in a room where my husband should have been remembered with dignity. Guests began telling stories about Richard. Some were sweet. Some made people smile. His old neighbor talked about how Richard once shoveled 3 driveways after a snowstorm because the high school boys on the block had forgotten. His former coworker remembered the way Richard kept peppermint candies in his desk for anyone having a hard day. I held those stories carefully inside me, like warm stones. Then Vanessa stood, touched her napkin to the corner of her mouth, and said she wanted to say a few words. Mark looked up quickly, almost nervously, but said nothing. Vanessa placed one hand on the back of his chair. Richard was a complicated man, she began, and my stomach tightened. He loved his family, of course, but in his later years he worried about certain burdens being left behind. Her eyes drifted toward me, so lightly that most people probably missed it. I did not. She continued, saying that after a loss, families had to make practical decisions, that emotions could cloud judgment, that some people struggled to understand boundaries when circumstances changed. A few relatives shifted in their chairs. One cousin stared at his plate. Nobody interrupted her. That was how Vanessa operated. She never said the cruel thing directly at first. She placed it in the room like perfume and waited for everyone to breathe it in. Then she smiled at me with public tenderness. Eleanor has been through a lot, she said. We all want what is best for her, even if that means helping her accept a new chapter. My face stayed still. Under the table, my fingers pressed into Richard's handkerchief until the embroidered corner left a mark in my palm. I looked at Mark. He was stirring cream into coffee he had not tasted. When Vanessa sat back down, people resumed eating too quickly, grateful for forks and rolls and anything that let them pretend they had not heard what they had heard. The server brought plates of chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and small bowls of gravy. I could not swallow more than 2 bites. Across the room, Vanessa laughed softly at something Richard's cousin said, and the sound made me feel suddenly very far from my own life. Then, just as coffee was being poured and the first people began glancing toward their coats, Vanessa rose again. This time she carried the white envelope. She moved slowly, making sure the room saw her come to me. Eleanor, she said, her voice sweet and controlled, I know today is difficult, but some matters should not be delayed. She placed it beside my iced tea. A few heads turned. Mark closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them and looked away. That was when I knew he had known. Not suspected. Known. I opened the envelope, read the words, and felt the final thin thread between my son and me begin to fray. Vanessa waited for me to tremble. I let the silence stretch. Then I folded the paper once, twice, exactly along the printed lines, and slipped it into my purse beside Richard's handkerchief. The room seemed to hold its breath. I looked up at Vanessa and gave her the calmest smile I had left. Thank you, I said. I will keep this somewhere safe. After the luncheon, I walked slowly to my car, the envelope still resting in my purse, flat against my hand. The March wind rattled the bare trees as if it, too, were protesting the afternoon. I did not want to go home. Not yet. The quiet streets of Columbus felt heavy with absence, and I could not stop thinking about the last 46 years, all the moments Richard and I had shared within walls that smelled of polished wood and his cologne. I remembered mornings with coffee and toast, Richard reading the paper while I folded laundry, the way he would whistle softly while fixing a leak in the kitchen sink, the afternoons we spent in the garden, and how he always let Lily pick the tulips for the table because she loved that bright color. Those were the ordinary moments, the ones people forget matter until they are gone. I pulled the car into the driveway and sat there for a long moment, not moving, simply listening to the silence. Inside, the house seemed unchanged. The faint smell of Richard's aftershave lingered in the bedroom. His favorite sweater still lay folded on the chair. I walked through each room with careful steps, touching the objects he had touched, remembering how he had laughed when he caught me rearranging his tools in the garage, how he had scolded me gently for leaving the garden hose tangled. Every sound, every detail, every small ritual of our life together replayed in my mind. Then I went into the study, sat at the desk where he had written letters to friends, and opened the envelope to look at the bill again. The type was clean, precise, unemotional, and that made it even colder. Attendance fee, representation fee, residence fee, emotional inconvenience, $18,750. I traced the numbers with my finger. I thought of every dinner, every holiday, every Sunday spent with Mark and Lily, and the way Vanessa had always inserted herself into these moments with calculated smiles, small suggestions, subtle criticisms. It was all visible now in that single page. I placed the envelope down and leaned back in the chair, feeling a calm sort of clarity. Richard had always said that patience and observation reveal more than confrontation. I remembered how he had insisted on having the documents and letters in order, how he had made plans that only now made sense. The bill was not only a statement of arrogance, but also evidence of the distance that had grown between the woman I had raised and the woman she had become. I closed my eyes and let my thoughts go to Lily. The girl had noticed the injustice. She had watched Vanessa's subtle dominance and could see it for what it was. Eleanor, she would whisper later, some things are meant to be uncovered, and some lessons are meant to be learned quietly. I opened my eyes, touched the edge of Richard's handkerchief, and felt a small reassurance. Nothing had been lost. My place, my memory, my dignity, these were intact. I walked back through the house, touching each familiar surface, as if to remind myself that the life Richard and I had built was ours, and no paper, no envelope, no whispered statement from Vanessa could take that away. I went to the living room, sat in his chair for a few minutes, feeling the weight of absence and presence at once, and then stood. I folded my hands, smoothed my dress, and looked out the window at the street, knowing that the world had not ended. It had changed. It had shifted. And within that shift, I understood, as Richard had always known, how to observe, how to wait, and how to move quietly with purpose, keeping one's dignity intact while letting the truth speak for itself. The knock came just after 4 o'clock, soft enough that I almost missed it. I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing the coffee cup I had used that morning, when I heard it again, 3 small taps against the back door. For one foolish second, I expected Richard. He always used the back door, even when the front was unlocked, saying the kitchen was the heart of the house and a man should enter where the heart was. Then I looked through the window over the sink and saw Lily standing on the porch in her black dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale from more than the cold. I opened the door before she could knock a 3rd time. "Grandma," she said, and her voice broke on the word. That was all it took. She stepped inside, and I wrapped my arms around her, feeling how thin and tense she seemed beneath her coat. She smelled faintly of vanilla shampoo and the restaurant's lemon furniture polish, a strange mixture of childhood and grief. For a while, neither of us said anything. I led her to the kitchen table, the same table where Richard had helped her with math homework, where she had once spilled orange juice on a book report and cried until he convinced her that every great scholar needed one dramatic accident. I made tea because my hands needed something to do, and because grief becomes less frightening when there is a kettle on the stove. Lily sat with her hands folded tightly in front of her, staring at the little blue mug Richard always kept for her visits. When I placed it before her, she touched the handle with 2 fingers and whispered, "Grandpa used to put extra honey in mine." "I know, sweetheart," I said. "He said rules did not apply to granddaughters." She tried to smile, but it faded quickly. Her eyes moved to my purse, which still sat on the counter. "Did Mom really give you something at lunch?" I did not answer right away. I had wanted to protect her from the ugliness of adults, the way I had tried to protect Mark when he was young and money was tight, and Richard worked double shifts through winter. But Lily was 16, not 6. She had seen more than anyone gave her credit. 4. I took the envelope from my purse and placed it on the table between us. I did not open it. She looked at it as if it were something that had fallen from a high shelf and broken quietly. "I knew it," she said. "I heard her printing it last night." My fingers went still around my teacup. Lily swallowed hard and looked toward the hallway, though no one else was in the house. "She said it would finally make you understand your place." The words did not surprise me, and somehow that made them worse. Pain is different when it confirms what you have been trying not to know. I asked her whether Mark had heard. Lily looked down. "Dad was in the kitchen. He told her maybe she should wait a few days." Then Mom said if she waited, you would have time to act helpless and make everyone feel sorry for you. He did not say anything after that. I nodded slowly. There are silences that come from shock, and there are silences that come from choice. Marks had become the second kind. Lily reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out her phone. I should not have taken pictures, she said, but Grandpa always told me that when people are being unfair, details matter. She turned the screen toward me. There was a photograph of Vanessa's laptop on the kitchen island, the document open, the same title at the top. Then another image, a message thread with a friend whose name I did not recognize. Vanessa had written that after the funeral, she would clean up the Caldwell mess and make sure I was out of the house before the end of the month. I read the sentence once. Then again, out of the house. The house Richard and I had bought when Mark was in first grade, with green carpet we could not afford to replace and a roof that leaked over the upstairs hallway. The house where I had painted baseboards on my knees while Richard measured cabinets. The house where Lily had learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Lily watched my face carefully. Grandma, she whispered, are they allowed to do that? I looked at the envelope, then at Richard's handkerchief folded beside it, then at my granddaughter, who had chosen truth over comfort on the hardest day of her young life. No, I said quietly. They are not. Her shoulders loosened, but tears gathered in her eyes. I am sorry, she said. I am sorry nobody stopped her. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. You did, I told her. Maybe not at the restaurant. Maybe not out loud. But you came here. You told the truth. That counts. Outside, the sky had gone dim, and the kitchen windows reflected us back at ourselves, an old woman and a young girl sitting between grief and evidence. For the first time all day, I did not feel alone. Vanessa had made one mistake she never considered. She thought everyone in the family had learned to look away. She had forgotten that Richard had taught Lily how to look closely. The next morning, I left the house earlier than usual. The sky was pale, and the air had that crispness that comes in early March, a reminder that life keeps moving, regardless of what has been lost. I drove slowly toward Howard Bennett's office, the envelope still folded neatly in my bag, pressing against the leather with a small weight of evidence and clarity. I parked, stepped out, and felt the cold wind lift the hem of my coat, as if testing my resolve. Inside the office, the familiar smell of leather-bound books and the faint trace of Howard's aftershave greeted me. I did not sit immediately. I let my fingers trace the spines of the law volumes while I waited for him to arrive from a meeting. When he appeared, he nodded silently, a recognition passing between us that did not require words. I placed the envelope on his desk. Howard adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and began reading the itemized charges carefully, his expression unchanged by what most would have found absurd. After a long pause, he looked up at me. Eleanor, he said quietly, your husband anticipated that this could happen. I nodded, not surprised, but still relieved to hear confirmation from someone outside the family. Richard had left instructions, he explained, specifying that any attempt to diminish your position in the family, to challenge your rights, or humiliate you, would be met with legal protections. He laid out the documents, including Richard's last will, codicils, and trust agreements. I traced the lines of the paper, feeling the weight of every word, every clause, every signature. Howard continued, Vanessa does not know that the Caldwell Family Trust has strict terms for conduct regarding family property, name usage, and public actions. Any violation could result in immediate removal from decision-making positions and loss of entitlement. I folded my hands in my lap. The magnitude of the situation was not lost on me. The evidence of Vanessa's behavior at the luncheon was enough to trigger the clauses Richard had carefully prepared, anticipating her type of manipulation. I thought about the envelope she had handed me, the casual cruelty of it, and how she had assumed I would react in fear or shock. She did not understand patience, foresight, or preparation. Howard looked at me and asked, what would you like to do? I did not answer immediately. I considered the options and realized that no words were needed right now. Action would speak louder than confrontation. Finally, I said calmly, send them an invoice back. Not for retaliation, not for show, but as a clear statement that their behavior was recorded and would be accounted for according to Richard's instructions. Howard nodded, making notes. I rose from the chair, feeling the air in the room shift slightly, the responsibility of control settling into my shoulders. This was not vengeance. It was the natural consequence of foresight, of careful planning, of decades spent observing and understanding the dynamics of the family. Howard placed the documents in an envelope and assured me it would be delivered the following day. I thanked him quietly and left the office, the sunlight catching on the glass buildings around me, reflecting the ordinary world outside and the extraordinary quiet power I carried within. I thought of Lily and how she had witnessed honesty and integrity, and how that would shape her own understanding of fairness and courage. The city moved around me, cars honking, people crossing streets, buses rumbling past, but inside, I felt the space of control, of preparation, and of dignity restored. Vanessa had believed she had unsettled me. She had not. She had handed me her own undoing in an envelope. I allowed a small, measured smile. The day had begun with tension, and it would end with clarity. The rest of the family would learn that nothing in a carefully prepared life could be easily overturned, and that sometimes the quietest actions speak louder than the loudest accusations. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at the Caldwell residence addressed to Mark and Vanessa. Eleanor watched as the courier placed it on the foyer table, glancing up from her chair in the living room where she had been sorting through Richard's personal letters. She did not move immediately. The sunlight from the front window painted the hardwood floor in long, warm streaks. Lily followed her grandmother's gaze, aware that this envelope was not ordinary mail. Eleanor rose deliberately, her dress swaying slightly as she walked to the foyer. She picked up the envelope with calm, measured movements, and examined the seal. No markings from the post office, no casual stamp of a courier service. This had come directly from Howard Bennett's office. Eleanor opened it slowly, removed the contents, and laid them on the table in the dining room where she had always shared breakfast with Richard. Inside were copies of the bill Vanessa had handed her, photographs of the message threads with friends discussing the plan to remove Eleanor from the house, and a formal notice from Howard stating that Vanessa's actions violated the Caldwell family trust. Eleanor's eyes scanned each line carefully. Attendance, representation, residence, emotional inconvenience. All of it documented and authenticated. She breathed in quietly, feeling a sense of order restored. Lily stood close, her hands clasped, trying to absorb the gravity of what she was seeing. Eleanor smiled at her quietly, a small, reassuring curve of her lips, and set the papers neatly back in the envelope. This was not about confrontation or anger. It was about clarity, about showing that truth and preparation outweighed impulsive cruelty. Eleanor sent a brief note instructing Howard to deliver a copy of the notice to Mark and Vanessa immediately, with an explicit statement that their conduct had triggered the clauses within the trust. By mid-afternoon, she received confirmation that the delivery had been completed. Eleanor returned to the living room, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat beside the window. She reflected on the events, the subtle cruelty Vanessa had displayed, and the calm, unshakable power of having the facts and legal protections on her side. She thought about the lessons Richard had left, how he had anticipated that Vanessa might try to manipulate the family, and how he had prepared for such an eventuality with precision. Eleanor considered her next steps, not as acts of vengeance, but as careful, strategic movements within a framework of integrity. She reviewed the house, the rooms, the photographs on the walls, and the memories of decades spent building a life with Richard, knowing that her position and dignity were untouchable. Lily sat down beside her, leaning slightly against Eleanor's shoulder, sharing in the quiet triumph of truth prevailing. The afternoon light faded into early evening, and Eleanor stood, placed the envelope on the desk, and glanced toward the front door. She did not need to call anyone. The documents had spoken, the consequences were set in motion, and the balance had quietly shifted in her favor. Eleanor walked back to the living room, feeling a calm strength she had not known was possible in the days after Richard's death, knowing that she had maintained her place in the family, safeguarded the legacy of her husband, and silently taught her granddaughter the power of patience, preparation, and dignity. The first call came at 6:17 that evening. I knew it was Mark before I looked at the screen because there was a certain kind of silence before a son finally calls his mother out of fear instead of love. His name glowed across my phone while Lily and I sat at the kitchen table, eating tomato soup from the pot, because neither of us had the energy to pretend dinner needed plates. I let it ring 4 times. Not to punish him. Not because I wanted him to suffer. I simply needed those 4 rings to remember that I was no longer required to answer every summons the moment my family decided I was useful. When I finally picked up, Mark's voice came through tight and breathless. "Mom, what is this letter from Howard?" I looked across the table at Lily, who lowered her eyes to her bowl. I wiped my mouth with a napkin and said, "It is exactly what it says it is." There was a rustling sound, then Vanessa's voice in the background, sharper than she probably intended. "Ask her why she is trying to ruin us 3 days after a funeral." I closed my eyes for 1 second. Even then, even with Richard barely in the ground, Vanessa had found a way to make herself the injured party. Mark came back on the line. "Mom, Vanessa says this is a misunderstanding. She says the bill was supposed to be symbolic, just a way of starting a conversation about responsibilities." "A conversation," I repeated. My voice was so calm it almost surprised me. "She placed an itemized charge beside my iced tea in front of your father's relatives." Mark exhaled, and for a moment I heard the little boy he used to be, the one who would stand in the hallway after breaking a lamp and hope silence would repair what truth could not. "I know it looked bad," he said. I turned my wedding ring slowly around my finger. "No, Mark. It was bad." He said nothing. That silence opened a door in me, and behind it were years of swallowed sentences. I thought of the second-row pew, the empty chair beside him at Benton's, the way he had stared into his coffee while Vanessa measured my worth in dollars and embarrassment. "Your father was honored today by people who barely knew him," I said, "and diminished by the people who should have loved him best." "Mom, please do not say that." "Then what should I say? That it was easier to let your wife humiliate me than to stand up at your own father's luncheon?" He made a small sound, but no answer followed. Vanessa took the phone from him. "Eleanor," she said, polished again, though panic thinned the edges of her voice. "You are grieving, and Howard is taking advantage of your emotional state." I actually felt sorry for her then, just briefly, because she still believed the right tone could change the facts. "Vanessa," I said, "I kept your bill. I kept the messages. I kept the witness names. Howard has all of it." The line went quiet. Lily looked up at me, her eyes wide, but I kept my gaze on the dark kitchen window where my own reflection stared back, older, steadier, less afraid than I had been that morning. Vanessa tried again. "You cannot remove me from anything. This family is Mark's now." I looked toward the living room, where Richard's photograph sat on the mantel in its silver frame. That was when I understood the final shape of her mistake. She had never really wanted to belong to the Caldwell family. She wanted to own the room, the name, the money, the story people told after Richard was gone. She wanted me alive enough to be blamed and quiet enough to be moved. "Howard will explain the terms at the meeting tomorrow," I said. "I expect both of you there at 10 in the morning." Vanessa laughed once, but it came out brittle. "You expect?" "Yes," I said. "I do." Then I ended the call. My hand trembled only after the screen went dark. Lily reached across the table and touched my wrist. "Grandma," she whispered, "are you all right?" I looked at the soup cooling between us, at Richard's blue mug near the sink, at the envelope on the counter that had turned one cruel afternoon into something undeniable. I thought grief would make me smaller. Instead, it had stripped away the last layer of politeness that kept me bowing my head. I placed my phone face down on the table and gave Lily the truth, plain and steady. "I am not all right, sweetheart, but I am finished being manageable." The next morning, I arrived at Howard Bennett's office 10 minutes early. I wore a charcoal dress, Richard's pearls, and the same black coat I had worn to the funeral, not because I wanted drama, but because I wanted everyone in that room to remember exactly when this had begun. Howard's conference room overlooked a quiet street lined with bare maple trees. The table was long, polished, and cold beneath my fingertips. I sat at one end with my purse on my lap and the original envelope inside it. Howard sat beside me with a folder thick enough to make Vanessa stop smiling when she entered. Mark came in first, pale and unshaven, his tie crooked in a way that would have made Richard gently pull him aside and fix it. Vanessa followed in a cream-colored coat, her chin lifted, her mouth set in the careful line she used when she planned to sound reasonable. She did not look at me. She looked at Howard, as if I were only the emotional obstacle and he were the real problem. Howard began without ceremony. He explained the Caldwell family trust, the conduct clause Richard had added 6 months earlier, and the protections placed around my residence, my financial authority, and my legal use of the Caldwell name. Vanessa folded her arms. "This is absurd," she said. "Eleanor is not being removed from anything. We were only discussing future arrangements." Howard slid a copy of her bill across the table. Were these future arrangements also itemized at $18,750? Her face tightened. Mark looked down. Then Howard placed Lily's photographs and the printed messages beside it. The room changed. Not loudly. Not suddenly. It changed the way a house changes when the lights go out and everyone realizes where they are standing. Vanessa reached for the papers, then stopped herself. Howard continued, explaining that her public action at the luncheon, combined with written intent to remove me from the home, had triggered Richard's restrictions. Vanessa was immediately suspended from all committees connected to the Caldwell Family Foundation. Any request she had made under the family name would be reviewed. Mark's access to discretionary trust funds would be paused pending full accounting. Mark finally looked at me, and what I saw in his face was not anger. It was fear, shame, and the slow recognition that his silence had not protected his family. It had exposed it. "Mom," he said quietly, "I am sorry." Vanessa turned toward him so quickly her earrings swung. "Do not apologize for this. She is manipulating you." I opened my purse and removed the original envelope. My hands were steady. I placed it in the center of the table, directly between us. "For 46 years, I said, I carried this name beside your father. I signed school forms with it. I paid mortgages with it. I wrote thank you cards, hospital paperwork, birthday checks, and sympathy notes with it. I buried my husband with it." Then I looked at Vanessa. "You try to charge me for the only name I have used since I was 23 years old." Howard did not speak. Mark did not move. Vanessa's eyes flickered, searching for the version of me that would soften the room for her. That woman had left the moment she placed the envelope beside my glass. "I did not ask for punishment," I said. "Richard wrote consequences before any of us sat in this room. You simply activated them." Vanessa whispered that I would regret this. I almost smiled. Regret had been sitting with me for years, at holidays where I was made to feel extra, at dinners where my chair moved farther from my son, at birthdays where Lily's hugs were supervised by Vanessa's schedule. I knew regret well. This was not it. When the meeting ended, Mark followed me into the hallway. He asked if he could come by the house later. I told him not yet. His eyes filled, but I did not rescue him from that feeling. Some lessons should not be softened by the person who was hurt. I drove home alone under a bright, cold sky. When I stepped inside, the house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Richard's photograph stood on the mantel. His blue mug rested by the sink. Lily had left a note on the kitchen table that said, "I love you, Grandma." I took Vanessa's bill from my purse, folded it once more, and placed it in the bottom drawer of Richard's desk, not as a wound, but as a record. Then I moved our wedding photograph back to the center of the mantel where it belonged. She had wanted me to pay for using the Caldwell name. In the end, she was the one who learned what it cost.